Welcome to Women in Boxing's International Women's event. We've put this together for obvious reasons to raise awareness of what it's like being a woman working in boxing or in sport as a whole, or just obviously women coming together and also having male allies there with us. I've obviously got Ronnie there. I can see that Dominic's on. We've got Joe on later on. So it's really important. So as much as we talk about obviously going forward with everything women, we want to obviously make it sure that we're not trying to say that just because we're pro women that we're anti men, because we're not. And I think that message gets mixed up quite a lot on these sort of things. So without me rambling on anymore, I'm going to move to our first speaker, who is Malissa Smith. She's over in the States, and she is a boxing historian, and she's wrote two amazing boxing books. One that's already been published and one that's out later this year. So over to you, Melissa. Can't wait to hear from you.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to join this wonderful event. I'm an absolute advocate for women's boxing and for their place historically. I've written two books. The first was A History of Women's Boxing, which was published in 2014, and frankly remains the only complete history of the sport. There have been other works that have been published by a lot of brilliant academics like Sarah Cruz at the University of South Wales. But in terms of really taking a look at the arc of women in the sport, this is the only book that's out there. My second book, The Promise of Women's Boxing, A Momentous New Era in the Sweet Science, kind of picks up where the last one ends at the Olympics in 2012 in London. And it kind of asks the question, well, what happened the next day? Was the promise fulfilled? Was everything brilliant? Everybody got places on cards and $1 million? No. So I kind of tease out what that arc has been like over the last 10 years. But to kind of start us off and to give us our historical platform, I particularly love that that I'm speaking through London, because that's where it all began, literally over just almost exactly 300 years ago. That we know that women have been boxing. And we have this because we have the evidence in local newspapers of women calling each other out for fights, which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it. There's the first fight, the first recorded challenge that we know of came out in the London Journal in 1722. I mean, that's kind of amazing if you think about it. But it had Elizabeth Wilkinson of Clerkenwell having had some words with Hannah Hayfield and requiring satisfaction, do invite her to meet me upon the stage and box me for 3 guineas. Can you imagine that? And then, of course, the answer was, I, Hannah Hayfield of Newgate Market, hearing of the resoluteness of Elizabeth Wilkinson, will not fail, God willing, to give her more blows than words, desiring home blows, and from her no favor, she may expect a good thumping. So that's essentially where we began. And women were able to continue to box in these little sort of either on fairground shows or in small shows at various stadiums in London, really through the 1720s into the 1730s. Then we kind of lose track, but we pick it up again towards the end of the century and into the early 1800s, before the Victorians clapped down on boxing itself for men and women, and particularly, railed against women in the sport, feeling that it was the end of the civilization. It then jumped the pond to the Americas, so to the United States, mostly to New York City, and boxers coming from the UK located in New York and started to put on boxing shows. And by the 1860s, we do find evidence of women boxing. Mostly this comes through newspaper articles, and if you comb them really carefully, you will find evidence of certain fights. Into the 1870s, when women actually began to participate in variety theater shows on the stage, performing boxing, both as just doing things like speed bags and heavy bags, or fighting each other. And they would have challenges to the audience to say, if anybody could come onto the stage and go 4 rounds and defeat them, they would win $25, which was a heck of a lot of money in 1875 or 1880. It was also a phenomenal time in terms of the place of women and sport itself in the larger sense, because as at the end of the Victorian era, we came to this concept of the new woman that actually started to embrace a range of sports, and the idea that a proper lady was no longer one that sat at home, very delicately doing crochet and rocking in a rocking chair, but actually performed sports and became more physical. And really with the development of the bicycle and the safety wheels, it really revolutionized how women were able to interact with their environment physically. So boxing kind of would ebb and flow in terms of its acceptance. If we find in England in the period leading up to World War I and then during World War I, there were many women who boxed and did shows mostly on the variety theater, but also in fairground shows. But there was a modicum of acceptance, especially during the war, when I think there was one ad I once found in Liverpool which said, "Be patriotic and support women who box because they're here to fill in for our boys, on the fields." So quite an extraordinary construct. And then again, in the UK, if we push forward, we get to the end of World War II, and we see Barbara Buttrick, who is kind of just this remarkable human being who at 5 feet nothing really revolutionized the place of women in the sport, both in terms of her insistence that she be allowed to box, even facing tremendous blowback from the authorities, even threatening her with jail. But in coming over to the Americas, being the first woman to be licensed to box in the state of Texas in 1957, or being the first woman to box on Canadian radio, end-to-end broadcast across the country of Canada in a fight that she had in Edmonton with an American boxer. So we have these little points of light until we push into the 1970s, when with the rise of feminism and changes in the laws in places like the United States, where women were given equality in the world of work, women began to sue for the right to box professionally and began winning in the courts. So you see this remarkable rise of professional boxing in the late 1970s in the United States. And this pushed out in little pockets across the world. And we find that there were smoker shows in England and starting in the 1980s and certainly into the 1990s, where women like Deirdre Gogarty and Jane Couch were fighting on cards. Even Barbara Buttrick, who had then transitioned to a role of being a boxing promoter and developing the WIBA, the women's boxing, a women's boxing sanctioning organization, held an all-female card in York at York Hall in 1994, completely illegal, did it anyway. So as I said, we have these remarkable stories and icons of people who really put themselves on the line to ferment the idea that women really can box, that we have a place in the boxing world, despite this concept that it's a hyper-masculine sport. Then pushing forward into the 1990s, when across the world, women started to be able to box legally in the amateurs, especially in sort of the late 1990s, there was a beginnings of a push to have it be an Olympic sport. And the first international elite amateur women's contest was or a championship was in 2001 in Pennsylvania, and it grew from there and finally allowed us to have the Olympics in London in 2012. In parallel, though, we have all these remarkable professional women in boxing who, despite no pay, no opportunities to be on boxing cards, continued to persevere. Again, women like Jane Couch, who went to the mat in the United Kingdom to win the right for women to box legally in 1998. And despite all of that, was still really subjected to horrific comments from audiences, and an incredible amount of negativity. And that really didn't start to change for another 10 years. And what we see now is much more acceptance of women in the boxing ring. I mean, look, in the London 02, we had that remarkable 11 female fight card in 2022 with headlined by Claressa Shields and Savannah Marshall, which was remarkable. And it also was remarkable for having over 2 million viewers worldwide to be broadcast on Sky Sports. And the continued commitment to putting women on fight cards by the promoter Boxer and by Matchroom Boxing have really made a significant difference in our perception of the sport and the opportunities that women can have. Look, our keynote speaker today, Natasha Jonas, who was an Olympian in 2012, decided not to turn pro after the Olympics because she just couldn't see her way to a career that really took Katie Taylor turning professional at the end of 2016 for her to begin to see the possibility of an opportunity. She then herself turned pro in 2017. And just look at what happened last year. For the first time in the history of the United Kingdom, the Boxer of the Year was Natasha Jonas, issued by the BBBFC, who in Barbara Butrick's day threatened to put her in jail if she even did an exhibition on a stage in London. So we've really come a long way, but the challenge for us is, what does that really mean? We embrace and love the fact that there are women who can get 7 figures for a fight, $1 million. That's an extraordinary accomplishment, but it also represents the bar bill of somebody like Anthony Joshua, if you look at the difference in terms of what those opportunities are. And if you go down the line in terms of what women at the bottom end of the card are earning, they're not earning very much. And it doesn't even cover the cost of their expenses. Yeah. If you look at a fighter like Heather Hardy, who's an American fighter who turned pro in the year of the Olympics, not having had benefit of a strong enough background in the amateurs to even try for the Olympics. But if you look at the trajectory of her career, where until last summer, the most she ever made was $20,000 or $30,000 in a boxing ring. And it took her fight with Amanda Serrano in the summer for her to have her first 6-figure payday. And the only time in her career where she actually had a month where she didn't have to work while doing camp. And that's kind of an extraordinary story. And that's where we are with women in the sport now. We have some brilliant women who are coming up, but they are not given the same treatment as young men. They're not being brought along as prospects and being paid to be in camp and just paid to box. No, yeah. Women have to work.
Absolutely.
And camp is, I add n number of hours to my day.
Thank you so much for that, Melissa. I'm just going to have to, I absolutely love listening to you. I'm going to have to wrap you up there because I just want to put it out to any questions. Just for everybody listening in, we're going to ask a couple of questions at the end of each speaker. And at the end of the call, we're going to have a 15-minute slot where you can go back and ask everybody. So Ronnie, just had your hand up there if you want to take yourself off mute and ask a question. We can't hear you. I don't know if you're talking.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's it. We can hear you.
Hi, Ronnie.
You're right about the female, the pay scale for female boxers. I know a couple of female boxers now what are still working for a living. They are traveling around to box, paying for their own opponents to box, and coming away with nothing at the payday. I know 2 in Sheffield were actually coming away with nothing. I've known one what wanted to box on their own home show, and because they can't sell tickets, they're being told basically they can't box on their home show. So you're right, it's come a long way, female boxing. On the amateur side, I think unless you've got the Eddie Hearns of this world, you know, and I know somebody who did turn pro was told she was too old at 40, and she's now a world champion. And promoters are going for it now. So there's still a lot of work to be done on the pro side. I think you're exactly right about the payment issues for the different scales. And it's not slight, it's massive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Ronnie. Anybody got a question for Melissa? Haley, Kate, go on.
Thanks very much, Melissa. What took your interest into that topic? Obviously, you do a lot of in-depth research and you've written those books. Why the focus on that topic in particular?
Well, you know, I've always loved boxing since I was a little kid. I grew up in the era of Muhammad Ali, so, you know, and was always interested in the sport myself. Didn't have the imagination to realize that I could actually do it to myself till I suddenly walked into Gleason's gym in 1997 and said, I'm going to do this for me. Out of that, I got to know women champions and developed an academic interest. I went back to university and got a master's degree and did my thesis on women in boxing, and really began to, as I teased that out, began to see just how much the gender binary, you know, male and female roles played havoc with women in the ring, because there are times when it's acceptable and times when it's not. So it creates a kind of liminal space for how women can perform, but also always keeps them in the unequal position of being able to manage their place in the sport and their acceptance as athletes, as distinct from something like MMA, where it's accepted from the beginning, or kickboxing. These are newer sports that the paradigm was developed for men and women to fight at the same time. Whereas with boxing, we have such a long history of it as a hypermasculine sensibility that it remains a difficult place for women to enter.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Melissa.